Hi, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, it's my pleasure to be speaking with Jarrett Zigon, a professor of biomedical ethics and anthropology at the University of Virginia. His book, Disappointment Towards a Critical Hermeneutics of Worldbuilding, is a really interesting read for anthropologists as well as philosophers, political theorists. He talks about the anti-drug war movement and provides a theoretical, philosophical lens through which we can think about world building. So, Jarrett, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I thought maybe we could start with a term that you use that I know while you haven't created it yourself, you use it in interesting ways, and you use it as a verb, which to begin is interesting to me, and that is of worlding, or to world as if to construct a world, I would guess. What exactly do you mean, and how exactly did you come to use that term, worlding, in this work?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Chris. For me, this concept comes from the work of Martin Heidegger. This is something that he was already talking about in Being and Time, published in 1927, where he was, rather than trying to think about a world that we are kind of standing over and against, that we, as a kind of spatial container that we move around in and just kind of touch and feel, but aren't actually entwined with in any kind of way, and kind of stands there as an object. He really thought about worlding as a process, and a process that we as humans absolutely intertwined with, such that there cannot ever really be a separation between ourselves and world. And so this idea of worlding or world is, as I said, it's very much a process, a verb, an ongoing becoming of the intertwining of humans and worlds, and I would say also things and non-human animals and so on and so forth. In the last decade, probably, perhaps a bit longer, this is a concept that is becoming much more popular in social and political theory. I think you see it in a lot of different disciplines these days. So I wouldn't say that my use of it is anything radical at this point. In some sense, it kind of fits in well with the general kind of atmosphere of some kind of, let's say, critical theory and phenomenology. But I do try to give it a particular kind of slant in relationship to politics and tying it very closely to the Heideggerian tradition.
Yeah, well, and maybe you could say a little bit more about how you use it in relation to politics and why that is such an effective term for you, as opposed to some of the other things that you talk about. Why is that so crucial to you and your argument?
Right. I'm addressing quite a number of different works and approaches in this text. So sometimes I kind of lose track a bit of precisely where I'm aiming at any particular moment, but let's see if I can pull it together for you. Let me start by saying that the title of the book, Disappointment, is meant to kind of draw attention to what I think of as the fact that today, no matter where you lie on the political spectrum, there's some sense of disappointment. And being more on the left, let's say, I think there's a real disappointment in where we find ourselves today, but also in the possibilities for moving forward into the future. And so part of what I'm trying to address is a general disappointment in left radical politics, where it seems like we've lost a sense of a vision for the future, for what can become. And so there's that. And another, let's say, position that I'm trying to engage with is a general kind of post-human position. Now, there's a lot in the post-human perspective that I'm completely on board with. However, as I try to make clear in the book, it seems to me that when it comes to doing politics, the human is still incredibly central. Now, what I think sometimes what gets conflated is what I call metaphysical humanism, which I define as the projection of the subjectivity of the subject onto all of existence. And the subjectivity of the subject is what I call an a priori predefined, very narrow essence of what counts as the human. So I'm on board with rejecting that. But that rejection of that very narrow sense of what counts as the human and how that gets projected onto all of existence, that in itself doesn't entail that the human, whatever that might be, is no longer the primary political actor in our contemporary condition. And so when I talk about world building, what I'm trying to get at is trying to move away from what I call a politics of the a priori, which is a politics where you get language like rights and dignity and responsibility, and attempt to mobilize these concepts as what Hannah Arendt called banisters, and in a sense project them onto other humans or the world and the world or worlds or what have you, and instead focus on what I call world building, doing a politics of world building, which is to say carrying out a vision for what the world can be in the future. I would say this is a long-term processual attempt to engage in politics, and to engage in politics in a more ethical and ontological sense, in the sense that it's not just politics of changing policy or writing laws or voting, although those can certainly have a role at times, but it's a longer vision of what the world can look like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, you make this clear from your book, but anyone maybe who hasn't picked it up yet, to help better understand the argument, what's necessarily wrong or unsatisfying to you about somebody saying we need more human rights for group A, B, or C? I mean, you talk about drug users, for example, and the war on drugs as an ongoing example of some of the work that you've been doing. What's potentially flawed about somebody saying these people need more human rights?
Right. Good question. On the one hand, I don't want to be sitting here saying, oh, I don't want people to have what we call rights. I'm not trying to take away the things that we sometimes call or label rights. But the general notion, the general concept of a right, as I try to show in the first chapter of the book, is very closely tied up with what I call this metaphysical humanist ontological tradition, which, among other things, ends up being a very narrowing, limiting kind of way of conceiving of the human. As it gets projected onto our social relations, I try to show and argue that it ends up being very closely tied to the way in which ideas of the nation state were eventually created. And so what you get is this increasing movement of the individual entity, the totalized entity, the one, from the individual of rights to the nation state to the globe, and now I'm going to say increasingly to the earth when we talk about, for example, the rights of rivers or the rights of forests, which are increasingly talked about. And so as I try to show in that chapter 1, if you do this a longer genealogy of the concept, it actually came out of interchurch debates in medieval Catholic Church over questions of poverty. And one of the defining arguments was that Adam in the Garden of Eden, prior to Eve's existence, had a right over everything that existed. So what was really important there was that the right that Adam had prior to Eve's existence was that it was a right that he had as an essence, as a human in the image of God, not as a human in relationship with other humans. So not as a social right, but as a right that came out of his very existence. Mm-hmm. And this was a right that was about controlling and dominating that existence. I guess what I'm trying to say is you cannot separate a concept from this longer tradition that it's tied up with, and that there's always going to be what I call a conceptual proclivity that no matter how positive one might try to enact a human right, for example, there's always this possibility of slipping back into a prior instantiation of what that concept meant or entailed. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is, and in the book, is that this concept has always been tied up with notions of sovereignty, control, and a limitation of ontological possibilities, perhaps most clearly articulated as the one or totality.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about world building and looking for potentials and futures that haven't yet come, How do you think about that or do that without slipping back into these sort of previous ontological positions? Like when you're writing, when you're thinking about this, you're putting forward ideas, of course, but you also want to remain open to potential futures that you or others haven't necessarily thought about. So how do you do that, and how challenging was that when you're coming up with this book?
Yeah, good question, and it is challenging. That's really the first move away from what I call this politics or even ethics or ontology of the a priori, right? So kind of the first step is a recognition that we need to move away from a starting point of the already known, the essence, the a priori. And instead, what I try to put forth is what I call the critical hermeneutic approach. And so the critical hermeneutic approach, in a sense, tries to bring together a critical theory perspective with a phenomenological hermeneutic perspective. I personally would say that in a sense, in a way, the phenomenological hermeneutic perspective has always had this critical trace within it, although certainly not always emphasized. So this move of the critical hermeneutics is this constant shift back and forth between the critical of a deconstructing of concepts, a questioning, a critical analysis of concepts and approaches, with a hermeneutic approach, which I see as a creative, interpretive approach. And when you bring these two together, not only are you doing, let's say, the kind of easy first step of doing a deconstruction of, for example, the concept of rights, and then hermeneutically trying to offer something creatively different, but you're also doing that critical move on your own work as you move along. And so the hoped for outcome of this critical hermeneutic approach is a creative reconceptualization of some of the most basic concepts that of our ontological tradition, but now coming from worldly existence, right? So I am an anthropologist, and part of what anthropologists do is ethnographic fieldwork. So that means we spend a good bit of time in what we call the field, doing research with people and groups of people. For me, what that's always been for me, kind of a way of doing philosophy or theory in the world with real people. And my move in the last decade has been doing theory, philosophy, anthropology, what I'm now calling critical hermeneutics, as this critical reconceptualization of some of the key concepts of our tradition, starting with the world and the people that I'm doing research with, which for basically since about 2006 has been what I call the anti-drug war movement.
Now, how has your work with the people doing anti-drug activism outreach, how has that informed your theoretical approach, and how has your theoretical approach maybe informed how you think about or interact with these groups? I mean, obviously, I'm sure that it goes back and forth. It's not a unidirectional outcome. How do you merge these two very sort of, I would say, difficult things to think about, these everyday real world issues, and then this, what could be called high theory or high philosophy, sort of stepping back and thinking about the concepts? How do you negotiate that?
Right. Again, not easy. So when I first approached some of the people that I did research with, some of them understandably were quite hesitant to have me be around. As several people said, oh, we have researchers here all the time and they never tell us anything we don't already know. And I said, I get that. I've read a lot of that work. And I said, I'm not really interested in writing anything that tells you what you're doing. What I would like to do is write something that I think you're trying to do, but you might not necessarily know you're doing it. They were interested in that, right? Because part of what they're looking for is how to do their activism better and more successfully. Now, for many anthropologists, if there are any anthropologists who ever listen to this interview, they're gonna cringe a little bit when I say something like, tell the people I do research what they're doing that they might not necessarily know they're doing. That's not considered a very appropriate anthropological thing to do. But for me, this is the critical hermeneutic theoretical move, right? Because for me, then it becomes this kind of recursive relationship where I can be inspired and think along with the people I'm doing research with to kind of rethink some of the concepts that are important in a general kind of political or ethical theory within our tradition. And then when I bring it back and talk with the people I do research with, that can then inform them in ways that, one, they didn't really realize that they were doing it quite that way, or what they were saying was kind of pointing in the direction of what I'm suggesting. And of course, then we have a conversation, right? I mean, I was slapped down plenty of times by people I did research with in the sense of like, oh no, that's just not quite right. And then other times, I got them thinking a bit, and we have this conversation, and in a sense, we both end up learning from it.
When you're writing about your experience and your reflection on that through these concepts, do you have a certain group in mind? I mean, I think it would be natural to have anthropologists in mind when you're writing, but also community outreach workers and also maybe various communities. But at the same time, it seems like you couldn't possibly be writing for all of them at once, at least not successfully. So how do you then think about your reader?
Right. So, well, first I'll say that quite a number of people who I did research with actually also read political theory and philosophy and anthropology and other disciplines, right? So, but certainly not all. So they certainly are reading that kind of material and getting inspired by it. But there's no doubt that at least this book is much more aimed for, let's say, an academic intellectual audience. And, as it says on the back of the book, probably the three that I had in mind would be anthropology, political theory, and continental philosophy.
And so then what decisions do you make when thinking about writing that coming from that approach might have changed if this were to be like just a different genre of book? What would you have potentially included or not included?
Let's think of it in terms of, let's say, just say anthropology and continental philosophy. If this were meant to be a straightforward anthropology text, it would be much more ethnographically rich, right? So this, when I'm thinking about writing this book, I made the decision that no, I'm not going to give the kind of ethnographic depth that a lot of anthropologists might come to expect. But that is because for me, this text is not an ethnography. It is not kind of showing a way of life or a way of doing certain kinds of practices as much as it is taking what I see as now an ethnographic archive accumulated for almost 15 years to engage some of the key concepts in continental philosophy and continental philosophers. So in that sense, right, like if a more traditional anthropologist is reading this text, they're probably going to say, oh, this is, ethnographically thin. Whereas a continental philosopher who might be thinking a little bit more traditionally might say, oh, this isn't proper philosophy for this or that reason. And I'm going to say, yes, you're both right, because it's neither anthropology nor philosophy, but it's an attempt to kind of bring them together and have a conversation and show how analytic traditions and methodological traditions of both can come together and perhaps provide something a little bit richer.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe it goes without saying, but for you, why was it important to include at least those communities and, if you want to call it sacrifice, certain depth in ethnography or philosophical argumentation in order to have at least both of those represented to some extent? Why is that a decision you made that you thought was important as opposed to, just ethnography or just doing a philosophical text?
Well, so it's the first book of two coming out from this long-term project of working with anti-drug war political activists. So the second book is coming out this November, and it's called A War on People. And that is a much more ethnographic text that still engages continental philosophy and political theory, but it's a much more ethnographically based text. What I wanted to do with this book, Disappointment, was kind of lay the theoretical perspective out that is kind of, let's say, the basis for this ethnography that will be coming out this November. So Disappointment is my fourth book. And so the other texts were much more, let's say, standard anthropology texts, but I've always been very interested in continental philosophy and theory. And even my more standard anthropological texts have always had this pretty strong engagement with continental philosophy, certainly in a way that is not as common in anthropology. So I've always been that kind of an anthropologist, but I've never really, let's say, set out my particular approach for bringing together anthropology and philosophy. And so, one of the things I was really trying to do in this book is kind of lay out my theoretical approach, which I call critical hermeneutics.
And maybe we can get into that a little bit more.
Sure.
How do you see worlds existing, which I know is a sort of broad question, but it intrigued me because you say something to the effect of we share worlds or a world, but we don't share it exactly because we all are part of our own to a certain extent, or we all see various things from our own perspectives, and some of that is shared and some of it is not. And so if I understand correctly, you're saying that there are basically multiple worlds in this concept, and that some of the problems, I guess, with other approaches is that they start from the assumption that there is one single world in which we're all exactly in, whereas that may not be the case. Maybe you could say a little bit about how you envision not just worlding or world building, but where we exist. I mean, so are we existing conceptually in multiple worlds, and how does that work?
Right. I would say that we primarily exist in situations. Multiple situations can make up any particular world, but we tend to find ourselves focused on one particular situation at a time. The idea of situation is really where I think politics and ethics begins. When we understand the situation we're in, then we can figure out how we can act, whether it's ethically or politically. But in terms of whether it's situations or worlds, you're right. Yes, we are always, in a sense, in multiple situations and worlds. And the sharing that we might have of these with others is never complete, right? Because worlds, let's say, are quite complex phenomena, made up of all different kinds of entities in existence, all of which are bringing their own trajectories into the world at any particular time or situation. So, for example, my wife and I, we oftentimes share a world, but only partially, right? And part of that is because, we have a longer lifetime trajectory that brings a lot more to that world from our own perspective than what the other will ever know about. And of course, as we spend more and more time together, some of that gets revealed and disclosed in certain kinds of ways, and some of it doesn't. So this is just one of the, let's say, most basic ways that I try to say that none of us ever share a world entirely. Mm-hmm. But I also, here and other places, I've tried to make the argument that there's, at least I think that there's too much concern with the notion of sharing or sameness. It seems like a lot of our ethical and political concepts, and especially ethical, almost depend on some sense of sameness or sharing, where I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think this is where interpretation and charity come in, the good enough, the close enough, the various other kinds of ways that we are constantly negotiating in a less than conscious manner, something that we then gloss over as shared or same.
Well, I think one of the reasons I picked up on that so much is because of what I've been thinking through lately in my own work. Some of the similarities involve this idea of potential and identifying potential, and also the shared or dissimilar worlds in which we exist. In particular, I'm thinking about, for example, the risk of crime and the risk of these discourses of the right that, immigrants have the potential to bring crime, and that's why we should lower immigration and stuff like that. And what I've been interested in lately, and in my reading and the stuff I'm writing, is about how you talk about those potentials and identify them, because they don't literally exist, and yet we act upon them and we create these situations like the Muslim ban in the US, for example, not because every Muslim is bad necessarily, but according to these basically far right or now somewhat popular discourses, the risk of any of these people coming in is not worth having them come in, and therefore we should just ban these Muslim countries or something. This, not even getting into the ethics and morality of all of that, seems to rely on this idea of a potential that the right sees as a clear and evident potential that just hasn't come to fruition yet, and they're trying to prevent. But then the left and other groups see this as not a potential worth banning all of these people from these different countries. And so what I'm curious about how your work fits into that kind of discourse is the difference in these various groups' opinions about the world that we live in and the potentiality in that world or in these various worlds. How do you talk about that if there isn't a sort of shared understanding? In other words, if somebody says the potential risk is not worth it, blah, 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 so we need these policies, and somebody says, no, the potential risk is not there or it's not worth doing this, how do you talk about that? Because both are interested in this future world and arguably in trying to make it safer, but they're talking about very different worlds and potentials in the future.
Right. So I think we've already stumbled upon one of my concerns with this notion of sharedness, right? Because when we start being overly concerned with what precisely it is we share, then we start being overly concerned with what I would call an a priori. I would say that to really talk about sharedness, you need to talk about something that's already agreed upon, even if tacitly so, and then in a sense projected onto our world. I'm in a sense trying to reverse that and trying to talk about our worlds as ungrounded with radical finitude rather than grounded in the a priori, in the projection of, again, what I call this metaphysical humanism. So if we start from our worlds and the relationality of our worlds, then I think we begin to get a different kind of conceptual apparatus for thinking about being together ethically and politically, right? So in this book and again in the forthcoming book, A War on People, I tried to rethink some of the most basic concepts of our ethical and political apparatus. And so in Disappointment, I try to rethink the notion of dignity in terms of dwelling. I try to rethink the notion of responsibility in terms of attunement. In A War on People, I try to rethink the concept of freedom as letting be, and try to think of the idea of care as attuned care. And all of these are ways of trying to start from the relationalities of the worlds where we find ourselves and have a conceptual apparatus that in a sense articulates that relationality and that worldliness of being together and being entangled not only with one another, but also the materiality that we find ourselves in, and how that is always, in a sense, kind of feeding back on itself to maintain a status quo, in a sense. But also, when we start conceptually thinking in this more worldly manner, in this more relational manner, that's where I want to say that we find potential in the world already there, just not yet actualized. This entails maybe reading the text because it's maybe a little bit more complicated than I can get into in our time. But the concept of situation for me is this complexity, and that's only in the world, right? The immigrant who is seen as potential evil or at least criminal, to me, that's an a priori, right? Like there's nothing in the world that bears that out as a way of categorizing an entire group of people. Although, of course, that is getting a lot of play right now, unfortunately. I just simply don't see that as a sustainable ethical and political position because it simply doesn't match up with the world. This is, again, so this is, as an example of the a priori, I have to recognize that is, the a priori remains a dominant political and ethical position in our traditions and in our worlds. But part of what this book is doing and my work in general is an attempt to rethink our traditions and our worlds in this more worldly relational manner to provide a conceptual apparatus that attunes our thinking more to the worldliness of us being together, always tied up in relationships, and then the kind of potential that we can find in that intertwining of relationships.
Mm-hmm. As you said, there's a lot more to what you're arguing if you read the whole book as opposed to what we can talk about in an hour or so. I'm curious because in anthropology, as you know, there's been a lot of debate about, I want to say judgment, although that may not be the word that comes up a lot, but the idea of going into different cultures and looking at them from a sort of non-judgmental, looking over the shoulder, what have you, kind of ethnography where you try not to come with your preconceptions. And as I think you say in the book, some of the advances in theory from anthropology come from this position of not assuming that you are presenting the reader or the culture with a ready-made answer or something like that, but rather you're trying to understand the culture for what it is. That said, it seems like you couldn't judge or you couldn't accept every potential that's voiced within a culture as equal, because then you get into this strange relativism, which is another debate that seems to have come up frequently in the history of anthropology. Is there a way to think about world building in a way that doesn't make you, the reader, the academic, the holder of knowledge, but at the same time not accepting all potentials, like that immigrants are all criminals and stuff like that, even if that's held by somebody or by a surprisingly and sadly large group of people? How do you make judgments, or do you make judgments, I guess, in the way that people want to build worlds or see potentials for the world that we can become?
Right. And so I should be clear that when I said that I'm looking for potential in the world, I don't mean it in the sense of, at least the way I just understood what you were saying, that I go and do my field work and people are doing and saying certain things that might be different from how the people around me here in Virginia are doing and saying things. And so I'm kind of making a judgment or at least taking a relativistic position and saying, like, this is another possibility that exists out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what I mean.
I
talk quite a bit about some interviews I did with some pretty high up people in the drug policy world. And in particular, one person who kept bringing up the question or the notion of dignity and how certain kinds of harm reduction practices done by this anti-drug war movement brings what she kept calling dignity to drug users. But the way she was describing it was that it was the actual, let's say, the communities of harm reduction and the kinds of networks and activities that drug users could get involved with at these organizations, in these networks of users, that brought about the dignity. So it was actually about bringing drug users into a certain kind of world, let's say, that allowed them dignity, rather than how it's often talked about in our tradition as kind of an a priori essence of the human, that the human is born with dignity, as we often see in human rights documents. So rather than talking about and the essence of a dignity that all individual humans have that somehow can be expressed, she was talking about building a certain kind of network, a certain kind of world through political activity that allowed people to have dignity. And that's what I ended up calling dwelling, just as a way to kind of break us out of what I call this conceptual proclivity of dignity, where if we keep calling it dignity, we're still going to hear that echo, that trace of that inherent essence that I want to get away from, and say that no, what she's calling dignity is actually the ability to dwell in a world openly as oneself, and then in that sense also be able to blossom as what one already is into what one becomes. So that's what I kind of mean by finding potential in the world through the field work and then through this critical hermeneutic analysis. Not so much to take the words that people actually say, but more to look to see where those words and practices are pointing to. What possibilities, what potential might they be pointing to that have not yet become possible?
Yeah, that's obviously a powerful element of the book in which you discuss opening up potential by, in a sense, deconstructing, but doing this critical hermeneutic movement towards asking where do these ideas come from? What might this mean? What might be another way to look at it? And so it's a breaking down, but then it's also a building or an expanding.
Yeah.
And so that does definitely create a lot of potential. Well, one thing that made me curious is how would an outsider who's not familiar with this kind of work, see or be able to identify that dignity may be coming from an a priori place, but not dwelling, or is dwelling also, but it's a different one that connects. So in other words, how do we know that your notion of dwelling is not a priori?
Right. So I also say that in that same chapter, kind of recognizing that this is an easy critical response in a sense. And so what I admit, that there is what I call something like a minimal essence to this notion of dwelling. But unlike the a priori that I'm being critical of, that is a real narrowing down of possibilities, what it means to be a dignified being, what it means to be a responsible being. These, in a sense, are all kind of adjectival modifiers of very narrowly defined being. Dwelling as a minimal essence is just simply to say that to be human is to be open. And in order to be open, you have to also be in a world that allows this openness to be, and so this is why it's important to all of these concepts I mentioned before, dwelling, attunement, letting be, and care, all necessarily go together, right? Because in order to dwell, one must be let be. In order to be let be, you need to be in a world that is attuned to itself. And by attuned to itself, I simply mean that all the existence, whether they're human or non-human, any particular world, need to always kind of be adjusting and attuning to one another as the existence. Let's just focus on the human for now. Humans are changing and becoming what they become in the future. So indeed, this is a minimal essence. I'm not going to try to deny that, but I would say it's a minimal essence that gives way to difference rather than, let's call it, a maximum essence that limits and narrows down into one particular kind of identity.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, like you said, you explain it in the book, but it's also interesting to think about, I guess, how someone doing similar work who may present different concepts than dwelling, for example, and how to think about whether or not they do open or rely on essence. But a slightly different question relating back to the earlier one I asked about sort of relativism and judgment. How did you find approaching something like the war on drugs movement and then the resistance to that? Do you feel like as a scholar you have to keep a distance from that and effectively sort of treat Nixon's arguments versus the people who were opposed to him and continue to be throughout the various iterations since then? Do you feel like you have to not come down on one side or another, or do you feel like you, in working with the anti-war on drugs people, you inherently are siding with them and showing them as a more positive influence on society?
The answer is quite straightforward. After spending all this time with these people, it's incredibly difficult not to side with them. Setting aside the fact that some people do have real problems with drug use and the ways it can affect them, I think there's no doubt that the vast majority of the problems related to drug use are the direct result of the fact of the drug war and the illegality of most drugs. If most drugs, if not all drugs, were legalized tomorrow, most of the issues that we now find related to drugs would slowly go away, as most of those issues are related to the fact that people have to buy drugs on the street, the contamination that is inherent to the drugs they buy because of the fact that it's not regulated in any kind of way, the crime that is a result of its illegality, mass incarceration in this country and throughout the world directly related to this. The ways in which the drug war has systematically in this country disappeared, in a sense, a generation or so of African American males, the kinds of violent policing and surveillance that have come along with it, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not in any way trying to tell anyone that drugs were legal, everything would be peachy keen. Far from it. But a lot of the issues that go with drug use today would more or less be done with.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that I don't believe that, because But in terms of the work that you're doing and the critical hermeneutics, do you think that it therefore calls for the critical hermeneutic approach to take a side, or can it be done without taking a side? And again, there's not necessarily just two sides, there could be multiple, but you are then situating yourself in a sort of specific camp, which may make a lot of sense, but could you do a critical hermeneutical reading from the point of view of pro-war on drugs, for example, or would that not work for some reason?
Right. Well, the book itself, Disappointment, is actually an oscillation, a critical hermeneutic oscillation, chapter by chapter, going from a slightly more critical approach to the anti-drug war movement to a more, let's say, engaged, supportive, interpretive, creative side, and going back and forth, right? So if you read the entire book, there's actually quite a bit of critical analysis of the anti-drug war movement.
Mm-hmm.
So as I've said several times, this book and the next book, A War on People, I could have easily written as, let's say, an ethnography of a rights-based social movement and the way in which it's clearly aligned with certain kind of biopolitical initiatives, right? But I don't do that because I wanted to do this critical hermeneutic analysis to find the kinds of potential that they might be showing us we can do as other kinds of political actors, right? Who might be focused on immigration and refugees or climate change or inequality, what have you, right? So I'm trying to say that some of the stuff that the anti-drug war movement points us in the direction of a new kind of radical politics. That doesn't mean that everything they're doing I agree with. As I said, I'm quite critical of some of what they do throughout this book. And particularly, they're taking up of what Hannah Arendt called some of these banisters, using concepts like rights and dignity and responsibility quite regularly.
Well, in the book you talk about the Anthropocene and a few other examples, I would say, but in using the anti-war on drug movement, do you think there's anything that it is not necessarily representative of, or that it is very, very generalizable into other movements? Or do you think it would change potentially, for example, if you were talking about conservation movements or environmental movements or animal rights or animal protection movements? Do you think that a lot of this would be generalizable, or do you think that there's anything specific you found in the anti-war on drug movement that maybe wouldn't translate into other things?
Well, I think any kind of political endeavor one might set out on, there's always going to be a specificity and a singularity to it that emerges through that particular concern, that particular activity. But what I do want to push in this book and the next book is that there is something that the anti-drug war movement is doing that is, in a sense, a kind of formal approach to politics that I think is quite different than what left politics has been doing now for close to 50 years. And so what I try to do is try to make a distinction between what I see as the dominant way of doing politics, which is a kind of an issue, let's just call it an issue-focused politics, in contrast to what I call a situation-based politics. So in a situation-based politics, which is what I claim the anti-drug war movement is doing, is much more complex than an issue-based, right? So if the anti-drug war movement was doing this as issue-based, they would be focusing on drug policy. But they realize it's much more than drug policy. It's also tied up with what I call biopolitical therapeutics. It's tied up with policing and surveillance. It's tied up with global militarism, tied up with inequalities of various kinds, whether they be economic, racial, or even what I call international, between different nation states. And so the anti-drug war movement as a whole are addressing all of these and other kinds of the aspects of the situation of the drug war. There's no way of kind of ending the drug war by simply changing drug policy. The drug war would only fold into something else if all of these aspects that I just named could be ended in some way, or at least altered in a way so they had a different kind of relationship to drug use. And then, of course, each of those things that I named, except for perhaps drug policy, are linked up with other kinds of situations, right? Let's say inequalities of various kinds we could see becoming entangled with the Anthropocene, for example. So these are the ways that it becomes important then to not just focus on an issue, build alliances, come at the problem, the situation, from the various aspectual perspectives, and work together as a globally networked political movement to address this very complex situation.
Yeah, it makes sense, and you do highlight that, and where you can see the potential of critical hermeneutics in general, and as applied to various causes, you sort of lay out, especially towards the end, I would say, of the book. Moving on from that and going into the future, and maybe including the next book that you're working on, where do you hope this will continue? What do you hope to happen, either as a result of, let's say, your book, or as a result of the kinds of work that you're talking about? If you could paint a little bit of a picture of what you would love to see in terms of maybe scholarship, but also political action, what are some of the things that you're hoping to see in the future? Well,
I think I say in the book that, let's say, intellectually, the most important work that I think we can be doing today is a rethinking of our conceptual apparatus, away from the banisters of the a priori and more toward a worldly relational conceptualization. I think our intellectual tradition, in a sense, has simply become exhausted. It doesn't really speak to our time, and we really should, get on with that project of creating the kind of intellectual work that might help us move into a future together. I think I know some people are doing this. I'm not the only one doing it, but I really think that this is really the most important intellectual work we can be doing today. Politically, I think I'm going to say the kinds of political movements and let's say the political left that I would generally align myself with, I would hope would take away the need to recognize the complexity of the world that we live in today, to get away from issue and identity-based politics, to look at a worldly politics of intertwining and relationality and complexity, and politics with a vision, a politics of world building, a politics that recognizes the long, hard work of it, that politics goes beyond the weekend protest that looks good on TV and is more defined by the everyday nitty-gritty hard work of showing up and trying to build a new world.
Well, I think that's a powerful way to wrap up our conversation. I think you say it nicely with that. I hope a lot more people will start to think about this politics of world building from your work and the others that are sort of aligned with this kind of movement. And I just want to thank you really, Jarrett, for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Chris. It's really been a pleasure.
As always, I just want to thank everybody who's listened and shown their support. I really appreciate the reviews, and if you get a chance, if you're on Twitter, Instagram, iTunes, send some positive vibes this way, and it will be appreciated in particular this holiday season. Cheers.